am so excited to have Professors Katherine Elkins and Jon Chun from Kenyon College. They're going to share their journey and their research on, well, basically storytelling science. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's good to be here. Thank you for inviting us.
So tell me, gosh, the journey. Let's start with the journey. And you both have such interesting stories. How did you get into the business of storytelling science, if we're going to be calling it that? And yeah, tell us a little bit about yourselves and your academic journey.
Well, I've always been interested in storytelling. Even when I was doing my PhD, I used to teach classes about storytelling. But I didn't necessarily think that it was the most important thing for today. And I've completely changed my mind now. Now I think that if I could teach one thing, it would be storytelling. Because whether you are on a jury, arguing a court case, a politician and trying to convince voters, everything is about a story. If you're starting a business, you've got to have a good story. And we're beginning to understand now how stories work. Stories really move us, they affect us emotionally, and they're incredibly powerful for motivating people. So I think that the science of storytelling today, it could not be a cooler thing, frankly, to be in. I just feel like it's a life skill and it affects almost every single aspect of your life.
And I find storytelling, I come about it from electrical engineering, computer science approach, as well as in graduate school cognitive science. But in the last half a dozen years, I've really been focused on artificial intelligence. And when you study the mind in neuroscience and cognitive science, and you realize how language, they say, is the operating system of the brain, it really is this beautiful kind of oneness that explains who we are, why we're special, what gives us our special gift to communicate and to think and to create and imagine. So to me, it's like a folding in of so many beautiful fields that explain the most deepest ground truth of what it's to be human.
And Jon, you also worked in industry for a little while before coming back to the academy, right?
That's correct, yes. Right before Kenyon, I was in Silicon Valley. I did startups. I was actually a director of development for the world's largest security company that had purchased us. But in addition to that, I had studied languages or I'd worked in Japan in finance. I worked in Latin America doing startups in Brazil and Mexico. And so another aspect I approach storytelling and language is living in different cultures and studying different languages and thinking in different languages, communicating with different cultures. It's really kind of an all-encompassing kind of life work for me.
Absolutely. And Katherine, you talked about your PhD and kind of more traditionally defined literature, and then finding your way into kind of storytelling in this larger capacity, in the way that our heart beats in our chest. We have to tell stories in all of these different ways, and effective storytelling is so important. Is there something special about literature as storytelling, as a kind of elevator pitch? What makes the difference between me telling you a story at dinner time and Virginia Woolf writing a novel?
Well, that's a really great question, because one of the fundamental questions, I think, is whether all stories have the same kind of emotional waves, or whether we craft those into stories. And I would say it's a big debate. And just to cite, precursor here, we have St. Augustine, who wrote his Confessions. And it seems like it's just these events that are happening in his life, one after the other. But I wanted to do an experiment, and I mapped his novel using computational approaches. And in fact, his life story has the same kinds of emotional waves and patterns that we see in novels. Now, Augustine was deeply religious, and when he discovered that his own story followed the same patterns as many of his most beloved stories, he decided that all stories, all lives have this shape, and that was actually part of his religious belief. But many today would say that our real lives don't have those patterns. When you tell a story at the dinner table, it's not going to have that emotional wave. But when we tell stories to others in a really creative way, really great writers will infuse them with that emotional arc. So I would say it's up for grabs. And in fact, I would love to hear what you all think when we teach, because it really is a question, right?
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. Thank you for taking us deeper into that, and also introducing ways that we can kind of, wrestle with this. You mentioned computational analysis just now, Katherine. What is that, and how is that productive in studying narrative?
So there's this thing called digital humanities, and I have to admit that I came to it as a little bit of a skeptic. Many of my colleagues were saying, it's just kind of not very interesting, it's kind of stupid. And so I was talking with John here, and I said, you know, my colleagues think it's stupid. And he said, well, how do they know? How do they know? Because now computers can do amazing things. And so that got me thinking, how do they know? And what can computers do? And that led us to this journey. We now have an entire curriculum. One of the really cool things I just want to tell the students so they know is these tools are becoming easier and easier to use, and we teach students who have no coding skills whatsoever. So the field is changing very, very fast. And I have just been blown away with what we can do with computational approaches now. It could not be more exciting. I'm not the greatest coder. I have learned. I learn along with the students, but it is actually, many of these approaches are helping us answer questions that people have been asking about stories all the way back to Aristotle. And so it's not just taking us in a new direction, it's actually helping us go deeper into asking the same kinds of questions and finding evidence for possible answers.
John, how are you seeing it from your sort of science background coming?
Well, I would say two reasons why study narrative computationally. Number one is because technology traditionally has been this other world thing from the humanities, but we've reached a point now in our development where it's actually become, at the same time it's become much more powerful, it's become much easier to use and more accessible. And so these questions that are rising, such as deep fakes, when you're talking about, for example, trolls on social media or deep fake videos on YouTube. So it's starting to involve the humanities, like how should society do this? And I don't believe that technologists alone are the best position to do that. So number one, it's very interesting, it's very relevant to the big questions of the day. And number two, maybe more personally, is that technology, because of its level of sophistication, has become a mirror onto ourselves. So for example, when you study narrative through computational methods, it raises some questions that you normally wouldn't think of. So for example, a lot of traditional narrative study is anecdotal, it's one-off, it's a very personalized experience. And so we get often down in our own little tunnels. And when we look at a computational method, or what the computational methods can reveal, it forces us to question our beliefs. It's like living in a foreign culture where all the assumptions and all your cognitive biases and your personal history through life are all suddenly on the board, and you can see them exposed for what they are. And hopefully, it's not that computational analysis will replace human analysis, it will augment it. It will force us down new productive paths of inquiry.
I love that. And also I love the democratizing kind of impulse, right? I'm no longer, as professor, the exclusive cipher of knowledge, right? I can actually kind of reach out, and we can disperse and disseminate according to the computational data. So tell us about emotions in all of this. You both opened talking about the significance of emotions, both the sharing and the different cognitive experience of emotions and stories, and how your research has revealed both of these.
So Kurt Vonnegut has a great YouTube video where he talks about these emotional arcs of narrative. And funny little story, Vonnegut wanted to write a PhD at University of Chicago on this, and he was told it wasn't academic enough. So he quit, and thank goodness, because we have the great writing of Kurt Vonnegut. But he did predict that one day we would be able to use computers and pull out these beautiful wave-like patterns. And these wave-like patterns are actually the same kind of wave-like patterns you might find in an actual wave of water, for example, or a sound wave or a light wave. And the way that the computation works is it tracks the emotional language of the story. So there are emotional language that goes up, and then it goes down, and it goes up, and it goes down. And so now we can actually pull out, using something called natural language processing, we can pull out these simple shapes of stories. And even though many of the different stories share the same properties, we actually have, each story has its own unique kind of fingerprint, its own unique wave-like pattern. Now, as he said, there is this question, we like to think that we all react to stories differently, right? We all have different favorite stories. Some things move one person and some things move another person. And, you know, as you know, the interesting thing about what we're understanding about cognition is each of our brains are very much influenced by experience. So on the one hand, we can track exactly how the language is working. But on the other, we can begin to investigate, just like Jon Chun just said, we can begin to say, hey, that's interesting. That goes up, but I don't feel it there. Or this moment is important to me, but it's not being picked up on the graph. So I really love it because it helps us understand both how we're unique and this kind of underlying structure of stories that really seems to be a kind of emotional engine.
John, what's your take on all of this?
Well, two things I'd like to add. I think that's a beautiful summation of it, is that a lot of people view computational methods for story and narrative analysis as too reductive. And to that, I would answer that computational methods, both deep neural networks as well as probabilistic models, have really advanced that, have enabled us to find a common ground truth that kind of unifies the human experience and connects us all, as well as take into account the personal variations, the many different worlds that we all experience in our own mind that add that personal, that individuality, that richness to life. So as a lot of people will think of binary, you know, yes or no, on or off, true, false, and that's not at all what this technology has evolved into and where it's going.
It's very subtle. And in fact, what we do is we go in and look at the results and decide, does it really comport with, you know, what we're seeing? So for sure, it's not telling us how to read these stories by any, the work and the interesting part starts when the computer stops, right? That's where we really have our role.
And one last thing, and this is not really what we do here, but is really kind of exciting, is you have Elon Musk with neural lace, you have a lot of functional MRIs, you have people actually doing a ground truth with the biology of neuroscience, as well as with stories and narratives. So it's not just computational simulations and models, but it's actually integrating into the biology and the neurophysiology.
Wow, yeah, I found too, just on a kind of side note, that many of my students that work with me and do this kind of work that you both are doing so amazingly and deeply, are getting hired by the Elon Musks and the Google.
That's great.
So they're humanities majors, but they're the ones getting hired by all of these industry folks. What is CoLab? What is CoLab?
Yeah, so, you know, I mean, we've always had laboratories in the sciences, but we wanted to start a digital humanities CoLab here at Kenyon College where we could bring in students into the research process. And, you know, one of the hard things about the humanities, as you well know, it's very hard to include students traditionally in the kind of research we do. In a class, you might write about a novel that you just read. We'll ask you to do that as a student. But for our research, we're not allowed to do that, unfortunately. We have to go and read all the other people who've written about that novel. We have to read all of the history and know how it fits in. And so it's very hard for students traditionally in the humanities to really have any sense of what we do because there's such a long latent period where you have to learn before you can do it. And what's so exciting now with these computational tools is we have students exploring something, devising a new experiment, looking at something for the first time. And that could not be more exciting. Our students are doing cutting edge research now in our DH CoLab. So that is what so much excites me about the field right now.
And I would say, coming from Silicon Valley and the startup culture as well as private industry, is that there's much more collaboration in the private sector, especially in a startup. It's all about people working together very quickly, very smartly. And academia, especially in the humanities, doesn't have that tradition. It exists somewhat in the STEM fields where I was concentrated, but in the humanities, it's kind of a new model we're trying to bring. And to give you an example, this past semester, I had a project analyzing, using natural language processing, analyzing China and the US relationships, basically looking at financial data, economic data, political science data. And we had political scientists, we have economists, we had physicists, we had mathematicians, and I led the group. And so it's the low-hanging fruit of being in your narrow little silo and coming and moving the needle for humanity, those days are long gone. If you really want to help humanity, if you really want to make breakthroughs or start a successful startup company, you need to bring a diversity of opinions and talents and work well together in order to, again, achieve something that really matters in this world.
Absolutely. Speaking of which, I know you both co-teach and you have the AI and Humanities course and others. So the collaboration in action, tell us how you bring this research into that space.
We bring the research in every day. I mean, every single student leaves the curriculum with a portfolio of research that they do. And a lot of it is very much informed by the class, but also by what we're doing in our research. So, for example, this semester we had a lot of students who really wanted to look at COVID-19 for good reason. And we had students tracking the emotional language of the various news outlets online and seeing if different left wing, right wing changed in terms of the emotional tone. We had a student looking at tweets in anti-Asian sentiment and trying to track that with tweets by various political figures. We had another student who was very curious to compare the emotional language of Trump's speeches versus Cuomo's speeches, and using the exact same kind of process that we do with a novel to look at their speeches over time. So we definitely have students doing that. And another great example that students might be interested in is this semester I led a class called Story Lab. What I wanted to do, we have a lot of students who want to be novelists here at Kenyon. And I really feel like if we're going to send you into the world and you want to be a novelist, we should make sure you can make money doing it, because not many novelists do. So we brought all the computational analysis of what makes bestsellers. And by the way, those bestsellers are like really bestsellers, but also the literary bestsellers, you know, Toni Morrison. We brought all of that into the classroom. And we tried to see if students could write consciously, knowing all these facets of bestsellers. And in particular, the experiment that I was not sure would be successful was I wanted them to create those emotional bestseller waves that we know exist in bestsellers. And I could not believe it when we graphed the first novel drafts and they had actually created those bestseller waves. So we definitely are having students experiment with these kinds of things and bring it into the classroom, but also hopefully bring it out of the classroom, right? You might have things to say too, yeah?
We have a website for our classes, and it's patterned after MIT and Stanford computer science, where all of every class, every student has a research poster in the tradition of STEM, where they have a digital portfolio that they can take with us. And they go from, we've had mathematicians, we had physicists, we have theater arts, we've had screenplay writers. So the diversity of our students is very unique. A lot of our students have said they've never been in a course with so many diverse majors and students. And
we also had students working with GPT-2 with AI story writing. Mm-hmm. So they trained an AI to write like their favorite writer. It could be a poet, it could be a novelist.
Rick or Morty screenplays.
You know, what we really wanted them to do, and this is the humanist, right? Because you can be a tech person, you can program this AI and have it right. But can you really analyze what it's doing well and what it's not? And that's where our humanists come in, because they know these writers. They know exactly how these writers work. And so they're able to go deep and say, you know, style, theme, emotional arc, like what is actually working here? So we've had a bunch of students actually working with AI that way too.
And let me just add, I think one of the digital humanities as a field has got the knock that it is a parlor trick. You know, it doesn't really translate to the humanities. And I would have a lot of people revisit that, especially with the advances in technology, where, again, the technology is becoming so powerful and at the same time easy to use. It's now in the hands of humanists. And they talk about low code, no code, democratization of technology, as you mentioned. That's really the emphasis right now.
Sure.
I can't believe it. You guys are running these labs that, you know, even a couple of years ago would have required, you know, a bunch of professors, a bunch of graduate students, and maybe a couple of undergrads, right? And now you're doing it right there with your undergrads. I love it. So for our high schoolers who are going to be with us for HumCog 2020 and beyond, gosh, what did you love about college? And what was the joy, and like why become professors as you are?
College was amazing. And I hope, I'm sure, yeah, and it's true. But you know, we're both kind of geeky, so I'll give you the geeky answer, because you know, you think of crazy parties and all of that kind of stuff. But I would say two things. The first is you get to be in a classroom where everybody is excited. Usually, if they got enough sleep and they're not too stressed out, they're all excited to be talking about something really interesting. And in general, I think we don't always see that in high school. We see maybe there are a couple students who are interested. So it's really cool to find what you're interested in and get in that classroom with a bunch of other people who are super interesting and interested. But I will also say that what I love, and I especially love about being in an interdisciplinary program, and this is true of your program that the students will experience this summer, is there is something really amazing about being in an interdisciplinary program. And a student just said it at the end of the semester. It was the same student, by the way, who told us that we made her cry during her first week of programming, but that now she has a superpower and she's so excited. But she said, you know, that she loves her English classes, but that this class was a class with all these different kinds of people and all these different kinds of voices. And I think that you find that most in interdisciplinary programs. That's where you find an opportunity to come together and learn from each other and have really different perspectives. So on the one hand, you find your people, but on the other hand, you also get challenged by joining groups of people that you wouldn't have thought were your people, right?
Yeah. And I would say I came from a Midwest, a relatively small blue-collar Midwest town, and so I went out to the West Coast, to Berkeley, and just totally opened my mind. I met people from all over the world, different cultures, different socioeconomic status, and it really is the most mind-stretching experience you'll have in your life. I think most humans agree that those years, and college in particular, what you get exposed to, the density of new experiences, new people, new perspective that you're exposed to, and the receptiveness of your mind.
That's important too.
So
yeah.
I am envious, and I tell our undergraduates that if I were your age, if I were an undergraduate, if I were in high school, I would be so excited because there's so many things happening, interdisciplinary, the breakthroughs we've made in neuroscience and cognitive science and computer science and genomics, it's just phenomenal. And I think
humanities has a role to play.
Yes.
I mean, as you said,
absolutely.
I mean, one of the reasons why we started our courses was that you believed that humanists need to be weighing in on all these kinds of questions, right? Yes. Particularly about technology today. And we need the humanists there. So it's yes. super important. Like for a while, humanities enrollments were dropping. There was really a question about whether the humanities would find its way. But I'm convinced that we have found the way. And Nick Bostrom, who writes about AI, has this great expression. He says philosophy has a deadline. And philosophy does have a deadline right now, frankly. And we all need to be thinking about this. So I would also say that science is really exciting, but it's also demanding of the humanists that we think deeply about what we want for humanity.
And I would add that, just as an aside, one of the best paying positions in Silicon Valley is not the engineer. It's the product manager who can communicate with the engineer, communicate with the customer, communicate with the executive staff, communicate with the media. And so having that talent stack, being able to be fluent in technology, being able to be fluent in human and communicate, to write and speak well, those are really premium skills. Those are the skills for the future. And so, yeah, I would agree that these interdisciplinary skills, these are humanist students.
They need to understand cognition.
They need to understand.
I mean, you know, one of the things I don't know if you feel the same way is we know so much more about how our biases work today. We know so much more about how we make poor decisions. We don't think clearly, right? And I feel very, very passionately that the humanities needs an upgrade in its methodology, because we don't always necessarily teach to counteract these biases. I hate to say that. I want to think it's not true. But if you take what we know now from cognitive studies and bring it into the humanities really is a superpower. But we do need to do that. We do need to bring those lessons in and maybe change up our methodology a little bit so that we do it better than we used to.
Absolutely. Listening to one another and learning and pushing forward, really, instead of, like John had mentioned, the kind of silo effect of the university of yesterday. Creating these spaces that you guys are so actively and beautifully doing there. So what is next for you and your students? And yeah.
Oh, we're just so excited, right? We have the problem, honestly, is we have too many projects. We have,
Yes.
we actually have alum who aren't working right now because of COVID-19 who are coming back virtually to the lab this summer to work on some projects. We're really interested in moving into this realm of social networks and how social networks work. So we're going to be looking at the rise and fall of social networks, particularly surrounding the Women's March, using tweets there. And we also have AI hybrid theater. So we're working with a director. Unfortunately, the theaters are closed right now, so we're trying to figure out how to make it work. But we're going to have some improv actors have a conversation with an AI. And it's really, so far what we found, maybe we should wait for the class, I don't know, maybe students should guess, but it really is changing how improv works, because when you improv with a human, well, let's just say the AI has some challenges, but also some revelation. So, yeah.
And so one of the interesting aspects of that theater project is it's not just generating language that's convincing, but also creating characters with arcs, with desires. If you've been in an acting class, you know, if you're an actor on stage, you have to find out what your motivation is, what's your backstory. And so the interesting thing is, through these simulations, whether it's econ or psychology or, you know, AI, pure AI, they're developing these models. And there are chatbots in Asia that they've demoed that people online would rather talk to the chatbots than real humans, because they reverse engineer and they are designed to really be the perfect listening and the perfect conversation pattern. And so this raises a lot of questions down the line when this technology in 10, 20 years, imagine how far it will be. And what are the ethical concerns when people prefer AI companionship? And again, it's all mediated through language and narrative. This is a question for
humanists. This is why we need to be involved, right?
Very fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes, it's our future. Absolutely. It's funny, this morning I asked Alexa what time it was. And of course, my response after Alexa told me was, "Oh, thank you very much. And then have a nice day." And I said, "Well, you too." And think twice about it. Katherine and John, thank you so much for sharing a little bit of your journey and how important storytelling science is, how important real cross-disciplinary conversation and listening is in making and generating new spaces for knowledge. Thank you.
It's our pleasure.
Our pleasure.